I was telling you yesterday, I got on Instagram. I do rarely, but I got on Instagram, and I was astounded by the sheer number of videos that were just like thrown at me of Ricardo Salinas Pliego yelling, "Vamos tras los zurdos! We're going after the lefties!" Just se van a la chingada, and people just clapping, and some Polanco restaurant. It was a weird scene, unexpected scene.
He's gone a bit overboard, and I use the nautical metaphor advisedly because one of those videos is him on his yacht, obviously, and he's at the captain's helm. He's steering the mighty vessel, and he's saying something like, "There's nothing worse than to veer left, and then you'll hit sandy shoals and go to hell or something." So that's why I always say, off we go to the extreme right or something. Like, what are you doing? Like, who openly labels themselves as extreme right? But then I realized if you ever challenged him on that, he'd say it's a joke. He'd say it's just a bit of fun on TikTok. Why are you being such a stick in the mud?
Yes, and that's what's scary, right? He has a very big platform, which he's obviously paying for, or someone is. And he's using it to say some pretty dangerous things and getting quite a bit of support. But then, it's all a joke, so it's fine. I can say whatever I want.
I think we've got a bit ahead of ourselves because there's a bit of context here that we need to rewind on. So, Ricardo Salinas Pliego is one of Mexico's richest men, currently Mexico's fifth richest man. He is
miserable fifth.
Yeah, I know. He's a television and supermarket mogul. And he has become one of the strongest voices in the opposition against the government, even though he technically doesn't belong to any political party. But he's more or less now seen as the opposition presidential candidate in waiting, which is crazy because we would never have expected this, especially, I think, Ricardo Salinas Pliego about a year ago. But a series of factors that we'll probably talk about led him not only to become this great opposition figure to face off against Claudia Sheinbaum's government, but also, I think, crucially, he's very clearly moved towards a more explicit version of the right as he's become more anti-government. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, a bit more context, I think, is worth unpacking here. There's nothing worse than when someone comes to an unexpected audience to push and shill for their wares. So be unexpectant no more, dear audience. I'm here to sell my book to you. And that's what we're going to do for the whole of this episode. We're going to talk about Mexico's right wing in opposition, what it means to be right wing in Mexico. And sort of horrifyingly, wonderfully, Ricardo Salinas Pliego has come out sort of guns a-blazing, swinging, and allowing us to actually be quite topical when we talk about this topic, because for a long time, to be right-wing in Mexico was not particularly popular.
I actually remember back earlier this year when this book was being written, La derecha no existe, pero ahí está, the right wing doesn't exist, but it's there. We were discussing about where the right was going to go in Mexico, because obviously it's there, right? Even if it is by elimination, as you say in the book, Alex. But what will it actually manifest as? This was a big question in May, right? And it's November. And what the right looks like is a lot clearer now, dangerously so. So I think it's topical indeed.
It's always been clear to us, but only to the extent that we, I think, literally studied politics. So we kind of know the dictionary definition of what it means to be left-wing and right-wing. But it's actually quite an abstract concept to a lot of people, especially sort of post the Cold War, where a lot of these concepts got muddled up. And a lot of the things that the right used to believe in went over to the left and vice versa. A lot of the things that the left used to believe in went over to the right. So, how could you possibly define something if it's so easily interchangeable? Well, I kind of get into that in the book. What's sort of weird and wonderful is that despite it being clear to you, it's not so clear to lots of people who aren't experts, but also a lot of people who are very clearly right-wing and should know much better are very, very keen to make you know that they're definitely not right-wing. That's why I think it's important for Salinas Pliego to be so over the top about him being like, oh, I'm extreme right-wing. It's a bit like Nayib Bukele saying he's the coolest dictator on earth. They're sort of making light of the concept, because they're undermining the whole point of it, which is like, oh, you think I'm right-wing? That's such a silly thing to think. But the weird thing is, anyone who I actually thought was right-wing more or less had that approach. There's this wonderful quote in the book by... It was one person who said this specifically to me, but I had a different version from lots of people of pretty much the same thing, which is, darling, I have no idea why you're writing this book. There's no such thing as the right. That's an invention of the left. And that's more or less where I came up with that title for the chapter, which is Derecha por Eliminación, right by elimination, because ultimately it's such a strange concept to have where you definitely don't identify as right-wing. The right doesn't exist in your mind. But the left is not only in existence, but a present danger. The left definitely is something, and it's very much there.
Let's go back a little bit to the beginning. You said something really interesting, Alex, which is it didn't make sense, at least in Mexico, to call yourself right-wing. And indeed, people who, ticked all the boxes of what being right-wing used to not label themselves as members of the right. So tell us a little bit about that.
It's something I get into in the book, and it's ultimately a strange historical accident. Mexico is very against the concept of being right-wing. I know that there's lots of other places in the world where saying you're right-wing is something you avoid because it's unfashionable, because, the liberal elites and whatever. But in Mexico, it's been out of fashion for about at least 100 years. You could say even before that, with the great victory of Benito Juarez in the 19th century, the liberal president who steamrolled the conservatives. We've talked a lot about that, the Cinco de Mayo war, and of course, the liberal triumph. And so I'll link that in the show notes. But after that, the decisive triumph of the left, the liberal left at least, is the destruction of religious uprising right after the Mexican Revolution that tries to fight against an explicitly atheist government. Now, this is different from a secular government, from, like, say, France, where they're like, every religion is the same, just keep it private and whatever. In Mexico, it was actively atheist. So it was basically taking revenge on the church, which they saw as a great force for reaction in Mexico after the revolution. And so they try to crush it. And they do some pretty autocratic and draconian things, right? They strip the clergy of the vote. Literally, they aren't able to vote. They're not allowed to talk politics in public. They're not allowed to wear their vestments in public either. It's pretty repressive, right? And so they rise up, and then they got crushed. And the church goes to the government and says, right, we will keep to ourselves, and you've won, basically. And so because the church was the right, it was seen as the reaction, it was defined as being part of the counter-revolutionary right, then by definition, if you were good and honest and true to the revolution, you are of the left. And then there's no need to talk about it anymore. And so the right disappears, and therefore the left is the only thing that is left. And then a lot of people would say to me, that's weird, because more or less in that era, the sort of 1930s, 40s, you see that rising of a political party that is in opposition to the Party of the Revolution, which is a party that still exists today. Both of them. The Party of the Revolution is now known as the PRI, the Party of the Institutionalized Revolution. And then on the other side, you've got the PAN, the Party of National Action. And I think it's really important here for you to notice that they don't say they're right-wing. It's National Action. Why is it that? Because really, its origins are not in the right. They're simply in opposition to what they see as the betrayal of the Mexican Constitution. A Mexican Constitution, mind you, written after the revolution in even what we now think of as the origins of the right-wing party are actually not right-wing at all.
I think it's particularly interesting because, I mean, they're the opposition, but they're the loyal opposition, right? They are very important because their whole thing is to say, look, we don't fully agree with what you're saying and what you're doing. We will define the opposition. However, we will work within the framework of institutions, and you are the institutionalization of the revolution. Therefore, you're in charge. We're just occasionally going to disagree.
What's that famous phrase from Arráncame la Vida about that terrible revolutionary general?
Oh, I love that. He says, the revolution lives on, but it lives on within the framework of the law. And since we're the law, they're fucked.
And that was basically Mexican history for the whole of the 20th century, until actually, no, not the whole of the 20th century, you get this crazy thing just across the water, which is the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution is a disaster for the Mexican revolutionaries, who are now old and very institutionalized and in power, because they've been outflanked from the left. And so they start saying things like, oh, well, we love the Cuban Revolution because it's basically like us, because we're basically Cuban revolutionaries as well in spirit. And that horrifies the PAN. And that's when you start getting hints of that right-wing reaction, that sort of McCarthyism. But before that, you didn't really. And so it's weird. It only becomes right-wing when the PRI, the Revolutionary Party, becomes explicitly pro-Castro and therefore far left-wing in its speeches.
I think that's something that's really interesting, because throughout Mexican history, I mean, the history of many countries, but in Mexico it's particularly clear. You have no one is actually who they say they are, for a variety of reasons, often many of them coming from abroad, right? But if we go back in time again, back to before La Guerra de los Cristeros, this war against an atheist government that you mentioned. If we go before that, Porfirio Diaz, who is overthrown by the revolution, he was a liberal sort of victor. He's one of the great generals of the Cinco de Mayo. He must have been part of that left, right? But then he's in cahoots with classic elements of the right, the army. Well, he is a general, the church, the powers that be in finance and banking, right throughout his dictatorship. But then, so this man of the left ends up becoming the right and is overthrown, and you get the new sort of post-revolutionary government that is now the new left. But as time goes by, let's go back to this thing that you mentioned about McCarthyism. The U.S. comes in, right? Because you get into the 60s, and you can't have your southern neighbor actually being in favor of the Cuban Revolution. So the PRI, which is supposed to be on the left, slowly moves to the right. They call it center, but it gets pretty righty in several instances. But then that opposition, which was the right, even if they didn't call themselves that, has to be even further right. But no one actually admits to being any of this.
There's a wonderful, very Mexican element to this whole story, which is that everyone's a liberal. Liberal is a weird term because it's used very differently in different countries, because it's such an old political term that has come to branch off into many different variants of liberalism. But this kind of goes insane in Mexico, because Porfirio Diaz is a liberal. The anarchist opposition call themselves the Mexican Liberal Party. The people who are on the right of Porfirio Diaz call themselves liberals. And then the whole Mexican Revolution ends up with everyone saying, well, we're all liberals because we're all the heirs of Benito Juarez, right? We're all trying to harken back to that. And the 1917 Constitution is very much modeled on the mid-19th century Constitution of the liberal regime. And you see that all the way to our days. Everyone today calls themselves not a revolutionary, but a liberal. But that was weird, I think, for a lot of people who we now recognize to be on the right. And I think explains why they think the right doesn't exist. Because they will tend to call themselves liberals, like people who I think are center-right. Fair enough. Lots of people would call themselves center-right, a bit like George Bush or Sarkozy or David Cameron. Like, they're perfectly happy to say they're center-right. But in Mexico, you couldn't possibly say that. I'm a liberal, is what they'd say. And that's because they took control of the term at the end of the 20th century. The sort of end of the Cold War means that whoever gets to own the term liberal is actually who owns Mexican ideology, because to be liberal is to be Mexican, is basically an overarching truth in Mexico since the 19th century. And so we get this very famous essay from a very famous intellectual called Enrique Krause, which is called Por una democracia sin adjetivos, for a democracy without adjectives. And what I love about that essay is that it ends up in a contradiction that he doesn't realize is a contradiction, which is the only democracy without adjectives can't be a socialist democracy. It can't be a popular democracy. The only democracy without adjectives, the only true democracy, is a liberal democracy. You're like, that's an adjective. But because it means, it's almost like an term that encompasses everything, he didn't realize it. And it was his definition of liberal back in the day, 1990s triumphalist post-Cold War liberalism, which was pretty much classic center-right, that to him was seen as the overwhelming center. And that's sort of the beginning, I think, of our era. The beginning of our era starts not with the Mexican transition, but rather with an agglomeration of the PRI, the previously revolutionary left-wing party, and the PAN, the previously not right-wing party, coalescing around this vision that neutrality means to be liberal, and liberal at the end of the 19s means to be center-right, which means Washington Consensus, it means free markets, it means deregulation, and it means democratization. We talked about the Washington Consensus in another podcast, so I'll link that, but that sort of sets the stage for the real story, I think, of the modern Mexican right wing.
Yeah, what you're saying about, Clausen not being aware of the fact that, he's using the term liberal, it was a very charged term, as a charged term is interesting. And it reminds me, when I went to college, I went to a very sort of classic neoliberal school in Mexico. And I remember being taught so many things in economic policy and them being all around the liberal markets, and then being like, well, this is not a debate. This is not one of the options. It's just objectively the best way to do things. Fast forward a few years, and it's not so clear anymore. In many schools, including the school I went to, it's become quite apparent that there's a lot of change in the air. So this thing that we took for granted could not have been taken for granted. But that, of course, takes us into the fall of the PRI, right? And the ushering in of this neoliberal policy of the 1990s and into the 2000s, and Mexico being inserted into a brand new world, a brave new world in which the markets rule supreme. And in this new world, it's the PAN who is in charge, the PAN, this formerly right-wing party. And at the head of this sort of revolution, let's say, is an unlikely character.
Or a very likely character he's basically the embodiment of the zeitgeist of the times. He is a boot-wearing cowboy who worked for the Coca-Cola company, had no interest in politics until he said, that's enough of this. I'm going to bring some corporate governance into Mexico and sort it out. And so we have the rise of Vicente Fox, who is probably one of the more colorful characters of Mexican history. And he is the man who brings Mexico to democracy in the year 2000. The great issue, I think, and we can discuss whether you think it's true or not, is the PAN still refuses to see itself as right-wing. It's simply a party that goes with the logic of the times and therefore is just right. It is historically right. There's no other way of seeing things. Therefore, it is the way of seeing things the liberal way and then the wrong way, which is the left. And that was more or less the consensus for a long time. But the problem is, when you insert that ideology and govern through it without realizing that's an ideological belief and not a factual truth, you start to make a series of mistakes, because it turns out that liberal economics, even though they might make a lot of sense, aren't the laws of gravity, and they won't obey your commands even if you put the knobs and switches in the right place at the right time. And so you get these series of terrible political issues and economic issues because of this weird ideological blindness, this refusal to see the government as right-wing from the government's own perspective.
Yeah, this reminds me of a joke that was made about Obama at a White House Correspondents' Dinner, where they were saying, no one could possibly beat Obama, for his re-election. No one, that is, of course, except Obama in the first election. And they were taking a stab at the fact that there was a lot of promise in what Obama could be. The first black president of the U.S. This is wonderful, and he did good things, but he wasn't everything that everyone hoped he could be. The man represented more than just himself, right? And I think that's the same with Fox. The country was done with the PRI and the way the PRI had done things. There was the promise of liberalism and globalization, and marketing taking charge. Vicente Fox is a marketing executive in his career, and there's enormous promise of Fox, and he's a colorful character indeed, and he's quite a likable character in many ways, and he would have been so beloved if it weren't for the fact that he was so disappointing. And I think he spoke of that broader zeitgeist of how much the promise of globalization has actually disappointed people enormously.
Yeah. And we're going to force the people to buy the book to see what happens next. But I think we can fast forward here, because basically what we have from the year 2000 until the year 2018, which I decided is the present. The present starts in 2018. But those 18 years of post-democratic transition and disappointment are also 18 years in which the government, first in the PAN and then the PRI, these sort of liberal center-right parties, at least sort of like in ideology, refuse to admit that they've got an ideology. They're just doing good governance, which opens the narrative stage for a man who insists that everything they're doing is not only wrong, but it is wrong because it is right-wing. And he starts filling people's minds up with this narrative. For 18 years, right? People think, oh, he must be very convincing. I mean, he was, but if you bang on about the same thing for 18 years, even Bernie Sanders might get to become or maybe not the candidate, but at least a pre-candidate on the ballot. And that's what we get with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, back in 2018, elected president, Mexico's first, we'll call it true, quote unquote, left-wing president since the early 20th century. And basically, he's able to do this in large part because he convinces people that corruption, that bad governments, that a stagnant economy, all of these things that people had come to hate about Mexico, the violence, that was all because of right-wing policy. And if only we could get the left in, then all these issues would be solved. And I guess this is where people start seeing a relationship with another populist who comes from the other side of the spectrum, but who starts riling people up against the liberal status quo, but from the populist right in the United States. And that, I think, is where people start to say, oh, wow, López Obrador is a bit like the Trump of Mexico.
I remember when for years before López Obrador was elected, and even during his presidential term, people would say, "Oh, he's going to be a Chavez. He's going to turn us into Venezuela because he's this leftist." It turned out that he was definitely some version of the left, but it wasn't the Chavez version of the left, but a Trumpian version of the left.
Now, I want to be really clear, because I actually don't like the comparison to the extent that people make it, which is, oh, he's Trumpian because he's authoritarian and populist and silly. But often I think the problem is, and I think it's bullshit, basically, this idea that politics is actually a horseshoe and the center is always on top. And then the more extreme you go, actually, the closer they get to each other. That's untrue. The reason it looks like that is because the status quo across the entire world from 1989 until, let's say, slightly after the year 2009, which is crucial because it's the Great Recession. It's the failure of the neoliberal model. During that time, the only acceptable way of doing politics was the liberal way. And therefore, it wasn't even part of the ideology, right? Now we sort of see it for what it was, which was a status quo slightly to the center right, which benefited business people, which looked to deregulate, which looked to gut the state, which looked to undermine unions. You can like that or hate that, but that's very much, I think, a clear right-wing policy. And from the right, but also from the left, the extremes, so to speak, there was a hatred of that. And when it collapsed and when the system failed, people from both sides of the spectrum with very different ways of approaching the issue came to power. And that's why I don't think, even though the critique was similar, the way that Trump and López Obrador governed were actually very different. And they were also part of very different political atmospheres. And that sort of brings us to the present day, right? The present day starting, of course, in 2018, but also moving on to Claudia Sheinbaum, who is now Mexico's president, but very much the heir of López Obrador. And we're still living in that post-López Obrador world where it almost feels like the left is undefeatable. Almost.
You talk about the present beginning in 2018, and there's this idea that we see a lot in historical analysis where, centuries and historical events don't necessarily fit very nicely together all the time. So you get things like, in Europe, you get the long 18th century or the long 19th century and so on, because it doesn't make sense to cut off the century, historically speaking, right at the 00 mark, right? And I think what you say about Mexico in the present beginning in 2018 speaks to me of a century that began in 1920 with the end of the revolution, and that ended in 2018, because definitely López Obrador ushers in an entirely new era. And today, his version of the left, which we could argue is not necessarily very leftist in many ways, is in charge. What the right will look like in this new world that López Obrador has ushered in is less clear. Becoming clearer maybe with Ricardo Salinas Pliego, but still unclear. Where do you see that going?
Well, we can start with López Obrador here, because I think you're right in that it wasn't the end of an age. It was cataclysmic for the political system, because virtually the entire way that Mexican politics worked, which was assumed to be almost the natural way of things, which was a three-party system with the right, the center, and the left vying for power in their natural fiefdoms, right? The poor will always vote for the left, and the rich industrialists in the north will always vote for the right, and that's the natural way of things. And then Morena, López Obrador's party, comes in and destroys that with massive supermajorities, basically getting all the people who were incredibly disappointed from all sectors of society to support him, including, say the stats, the very richest in Mexico. He won across all sectors. Fine, the rich did vote for him at a lesser rate than the very poor, but actually not by much less. So I think that's an important way of seeing it. And with all that power, you get the bully pulpit. And what is fascinating to me is that López Obrador was very, very quick at reappropriating the term liberal. He understands Mexican politics and history as one. And so he goes out of his way to say, these neoliberals were a bastard version of liberalism. The true liberalism of Juárez and of the Constitution of 2017 is my liberalism. And it's of the left. And that does something very strange, I think, because he's effective at convincing people about that. And so you get the weird death of the liberal right that refuses to see itself as the right, and therefore is not very effective at communicating. It goes out into the streets and says, let's defend our institutions, and they just give you a string of acronyms, and everyone's like, that means nothing to me. But then you start getting people who say to López Obrador, maybe you're right. Maybe your liberalism is the liberalism we're fighting against, and we're not liberals. And so you get the rise of the anti-liberal right-wing liberal. And I think that's where you can define Salinas Pliego and lots of other of the new right figures in Mexico that have recently just emerged. Salinas Pliego is obsessed with liberty, and he is very much, in his own definition of things, a Hayekian liberal. He's a libertarian liberal, very much in the Milei way of seeing things. But what's fascinating is he's also, as in his own words, jokingly, a man of the far right. So he's a liberal that hates the left, and a lot of what liberalism brings. So he's an anti-liberal, right-wing liberal in the Mexican sense, because everyone's a liberal.
I think there is something really unique about the Mexican situation we compare with a Milei, with a Bolsonaro, where I do actually believe that most of these characters, at least the characters are relatively palatable to the powers that be, ultimately do fit into some form of liberalism, because they ultimately want to play within some version of the institutional framework that we have. There's no danger here of anyone becoming a monarch. And people may not like Andrés Manuel López Obrador, but with all the power that he has just kind of faded from the political scene with enormous power still, but he's not active in the political scene. Whereas Milei, for example, he comes in, he starts, saying like this video I remember of him crossing out entire ministries, saying we don't need that, and we don't need that, and we don't need that. And of course, critics of López Obrador will say correctly that he has done much to undermine some of the institutions of the country, but ultimately still working within the institutional framework that defines the country more broadly. And I think Salinas Pliego still falls under that. What do you think?
I think you're right, and it's probably the biggest limitation that he's got. The big reason that he comes into politics, which we didn't cover at the beginning of this episode, is because he's forced into it. I spoke to a lot of his closest confidants, and what was interesting about him is that he looks good. He's an older man. He's in his late 70s. Doesn't look it. but he's vigorous and he's charismatic, etc. And he just wants to, live his life. Say his employees. He wants to go out on his yacht. He wants to go to the mansion in Malinalco. He wants to get on his helicopter and go off and play golf in Acapulco.
Don't we all?
Yeah, who wants to be shackled by electoral politics because of that? And so he's got all this money. He's got loads of influence because he's got think tanks and universities, the University of Liberty. And why would you ever want to be constrained by electoral politics? And that's in the book where I have a little ellipses, ... and then a new paragraph, and it says, in 2015, the Mexican IRS, the tax authority, started finding some irregularities in Salinas Pliegos' companies. And basically, it's the beginning of this massive snowball of tax issues that he has with the government before the arrival of López Obrador, by the way. This isn't like the left coming out to get him. This is the previous status quo, the ancien regime, going after him. And Salinas Pliego was in massive issues with the IRS and the United States. He had to pay a massive millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, to avoid going to jail because of an issue he has with AT&T. So he's not like, I think he likes to paint himself as a patriot who's very good and loves to pay his taxes if only they'll just let him. But of course, that's clearly not the case, even in the United States.
Yeah, it's not the left after him. It's not the ancien regime after him. It's him not paying his damn taxes.
Exactly. And so that, of course, explains a lot about why he's a libertarian as well, right? I mean, my favorite thing is whenever, there's a terrible crisis, like someone is murdered or, there's an economic issue, he'll come out and say, oh, this is terrible. We should all stop paying our taxes as protest. You're like, come on, man, be slightly less transparent. And so this is Ricardo Salinas Pliego, where suddenly he is faced with a government that is so overpowered, now controls the courts. We've discussed what we think about the judicial reform, which I think was pretty badly handled, but it resulted in very pro-government and left-wing judges in the Supreme Court, where most of his complaints against being charged so many taxes are now heading, and he's losing. He's starting to lose, and it's basically half of his wealth that he owes in taxes. It would destroy him because he doesn't have the liquid capital to pay it all up. So there'll be seizures. He'll lose part of his companies. So he's definitely in panic mode. And suddenly, electoral politics starts showing a lot of its benefits, including political amnesty from a lot of these charges. And so I can start to see a pragmatic reason for someone who might not have wanted to get into electoral politics to suddenly want to.
And that really, it opens, I think, a pretty scary door in a way, because many of the most terrible characters of a very terrible 20th are characters who should not have ended up in politics. They had no real political background, but they were kind of pushed into it, and then they were terrible.
What's interesting about Salinas Pliego is that there are good pragmatic reasons for him to go into politics now, but I think he has very clear ideological positions, and they're not these neoliberal positions of the past. He's very much for deregulation and for companies being basically mini fiefdoms with very few taxes and complete control over their workers who are meant to have very few rights. I'd remind our audience who doesn't know him, where he forced all his staff to go to a Christmas party at the worst moment of the pandemic and banned them from wearing face masks and crammed them into a room to show how he was basically in control of his kingdom. Pretty despicable. But it shows his ideology, right? He recently went to El Salvador and says stuff like, if I were Mexico's president, I would do what President Bukele has done, which is chuck all these criminals into jail, without, of course, talking about the massive issues with the Bukele system. Bukele has thrown more than 1% of his population into jail, which in Mexico would be something like throwing 1.7 million people into jail, which is about 10 times more people in jail at any time in Mexico right now. It would be a disaster in humanitarian sense, and also not very effective because the gangs in El Salvador have far fewer arms, far smaller structures, and far less capital than the massive multinational cartels that run certain parts of Mexico. So Again, right, it's a very ideological approach. Strong man with big gun wins fight is the sort of Salinas Pliego far-right approach, but I don't think it would work.
I completely agree. I think that's the great risk of pushing a powerful man with nothing but a bland and pretty empty ideology into power. Because if he, knock on wood, that doesn't happen. If he comes to power, he would be pushing an idea that makes sense for a billionaire to be a billionaire, not to lead a country.
Yeah, which is a big issue with the Vicente Fox system back in the year 2000, where he arrives and says, I'm going to run this country like a company, and then runs it into the ground because it turns out a country isn't a company. So that brings me to the point about Salinas Pliego. He's got the incentive, but the Mexican political system that we exist in, that precedes López Obrador, it precedes the transition actually in the year 2000. It's the 1990s political reform, which forces you to have a party, and it makes it incredibly difficult to create one no matter how much money you've got. López Obrador, who is probably a unique political organizing talent, who spent 18 years trying to do this, from a big platform, from politics, and being incredibly popular, it still took him 3 years in the political wilderness to create Morena, and then a few more years to get to power. So in the short term, I don't think the right is arriving to Mexican politics via a new party. What might be interesting is what we've seen with the PAN, which is desperate to cling on to some semblance of the power it had. And so it recently offered Salinas Pliego, if he wanted to, he could use them as a vehicle to become president. And I think that would be very interesting, because that would give Salinas Pliego the vehicle that he doesn't currently have to run from a very powerful position. I mean, he's sort of already been moving his pieces strategically. He's buying up independent podcasts run by bros. We've seen that playbook work before. He already runs and owns a media empire. He already has very big financial interests in his bank. And he's starting to reach out to other like-minded governments across the world, going on Fox News, speaking very, very eloquently in English, I think I should say, and also to other right-wing governments. So suddenly Salinas Pliego seems like a far more likely candidate than I would have thought even a week ago.
Yeah, I think that's the very unexpected and sort of scary part. But what is most worrying to me in that context is the fact that, yes, the PAN could become a vehicle, and they're offering themselves as a vehicle for this man to come to power. As we saw during the Peña Nieto government, the PAN has sort of lost all sense of who it is and what it wants to be. So it's now very powerful in name. There's a lot of history there, but it's kind of hollow. And the problem with having a hollow big name is that when it's taken over with someone with enough means and will, you can do a lot of things with it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You need a vehicle like the PAN because legally you need that. You can't, for example, it's so difficult to create a party in Mexico. I can't overstate it. You can't form a party. There's a 2-month window for you to create a party every 6 years, which we're currently in, by the way. There's massive requirements. You can't get any money from any private sources, and you have no money to create a party if you have no money from private sources, but you don't have access to public sources, because the only way you get money in the Mexican political system is by already being a party and having access to the money. So it's very much created to hold on to the status quo. But what I think is so depressing about the PAN is that they've made this mistake before. A big issue they've had since they collapsed in 2018 was that they're actually not very happy with what happened to them when Vicente Fox took over. The Coca-Cola corporate guy was actually very much the Salinas Pliego of his day. He is a man who came in from corporate Mexico who said, I can do things better than these politicians, get out the way. And he got rid of all the sort of intellectuals in the PAN. Vicente Fox, with not an idea in his mind beyond what he'd learnt in Coca-Cola, coming in to run Mexico as a company. And I mean, it's a different approach that we're seeing, because I think Salinas Pliego is far more intelligent. He's a very cultured man. He's a very structured and organized man. So he's a different beast altogether from Fox. But the PAN is still making that same mistake, offering its structure up to outside forces that have very little interest in whether the PAN lives or dies.
Definitely. And at the end of the day, Fox came from Coca-Cola is not necessarily the symbol of workers' rights, but he still came from within a framework. We work within companies that have rules, that at least pretend to follow the law. So Nestlé, as you say, runs his companies like, I wouldn't say even fiefdoms, I would say like tyrannies. So it's making the same mistake again, but doubling down.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be surprised to see what happens. But even then, I think Morena is still an incredibly powerful organization. I think sort of worryingly, if they're pushed into a corner and feel like they're going to be trounced by this right-wing populist, you can get them playing pretty dirty. And that's, I guess, the last chapter of the book, which is that final way that the right could take power in Mexico. And it's a way that we've seen before, which is the left-wing party becoming so overbearing that it's not actually worth being part of a right-wing party if you're never going to get to power. If what you want is power, you go into the governing body. And we've already started to see that. The most corrupt, some of the filthiest names in Mexican politics entering Morena, and weirdly being far more celebrated by the apparatus, because the corrupt and people with very few scruples are very happy to obey unethical orders, whereas people who are genuinely on the left might have issues with what the leadership is proposing, and so they're shunted out because they're not seen as disciplined enough. And you see the slow but actually quite consistent transformation of what used to be a left-wing party into a corrupt and pragmatic party that serves the rich and the powerful, which, under López Obrador's definition, is the definition of the right. The book is already out. I've put a link in the show notes where to buy it. Siglo XXI is the publishing house. You can buy it directly from them. I'm hoping to eventually get this book out in English if you're not based in Mexico or can't speak Spanish, but for now, it's available in Mexican bookstores soon. And if you want to come to the many presentations, I'll be tooting that horn a lot, so don't worry, you'll find out. But the first book launch will be in the International Book Fair of Guadalajara, La Fil de Guadalajara, and it'll be at 8 p.m. at the Fondo de Cultura Económica stand on the 2nd of December. So I'd love to see as many of you there.
I think it's really worth making the trip, because I know how much research went into this book, and only a fragment of it actually ended in the book. There's a lot of stories that Alex can tell, and just a lot more context that can be added. There's a lot to be learned. The book itself is fantastic.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone buys it and thinks the same.
This was Tao Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're talking to you about my latest book and banging on about how you should buy it.
Please buy the book.
But also subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist so you can get all the content that we're creating all the time. Because it's the 21st century, people. Come on, you can't get enough content.